Welcome back to Fireside Files. The phone on Nolan Greer's workbench lit up at 7 minutes past midnight, and the name on the screen belonged to Genevieve Kingsley, the chief executive who had fired him in front of a full boardroom 3 days earlier for refusing to certify a jet she called ready, and he called dangerous. Nolan turned the phone face down without reading the message, and went back to soldering a cracked circuit board on an old radio. The kind of quiet, patient work that asked nothing of him except attention. 17 calls later, the sky outside his window turned bright white, and a private jet dropped out of the darkness toward the runway lights of Red Creek Executive Airfield, taxiing until it stopped on the apron, directly across from his front porch. When Genevieve stepped down from the stairs, she was not giving orders anymore. She was asking, almost begging, for the one man she had once called replaceable, to save a deal worth more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. Before Nolan reveals why he alone can save the jet parked outside his door, tap subscribe now, so you do not miss a single second of this breathless corporate reckoning. Nolan lived in a small caretaker's house at the edge of Red Creek Executive Airfield, a modest property he had taken, not because he needed the work, but because it let him raise his 15-year-old daughter within sight of open sky, and away from boardrooms that measured a man's worth in billable hours. 3 days earlier, Kingsley Aeronautics had shown him the door, and he had spent the time since fixing old electronics for extra cash, trying not to think about the jet he had refused to sign off on. He was elbow-deep in a vintage receiver when his phone rang the first time, Genevieve's name glowing on the screen like an accusation. He did not answer. The second call came within a minute, then a third, and by the 10th, he had stopped counting, letting the phone buzz itself quiet against the workbench, while he focused on the small, controllable problem of a broken capacitor. Her first messages carried the same tone she always used with him, clipped and absolute, as though the 3 days since his termination had never happened. One read simply that he needed to call back immediately. Another informed him this was now a company matter requiring his attention. A third reminded him, without a trace of irony, that he still had a responsibility to fulfill. Nolan set the phone aside each time, remembering with a kind of flat clarity how she had told him, in front of dozens of colleagues, that his obligations to Kingsley Aeronautics had ended, the moment security walked him out of the building. His daughter Clara wandered into the workshop in her pajamas, asking why his phone would not stop buzzing, and he told her only that his old company was having some trouble, nothing more, because some burdens were not meant to land on a 15-year-old at that hour. There had been a time not so long before, when a call from Genevieve Kingsley would have sent him scrambling for his shoes and his truck keys without a second thought, because for years he had believed the company's mission was worth the sacrifice of quiet evenings like this one. That belief had eroded slowly, meeting after meeting, until the night she stood in front of the entire engineering staff and made his devotion to his daughter sound like a professional weakness, rather than the plain fact of a man raising a child alone. He thought about that moment often, not with bitterness so much as a settled kind of clarity, the sense of a door closing that had needed to close for a while. The workshop smelled of solder and old dust, comforting in its predictability, and for the first time in years, his evenings belonged entirely to himself and to Clara. He was not interested in being pulled back into a world that had discarded him the instant he became inconvenient, and he told himself that whatever storm was building on the other end of that phone was no longer his to weather. It was the 17th call that changed the tone entirely, followed by a message that read nothing like the ones before it. It said only that the jet would not start, and it said, "Please." Nolan stood on the porch and watched the runway lights at Red Creek flicker on, one after another, as though someone had reached across 200 miles to switch them on by remote command. A black jet bearing the Kingsley crest descended out of the dark, touched the pavement, and rolled to a stop on the apron facing his house, close enough that he could see the cabin door begin to open before the engines had fully wound down. Genevieve Kingsley came down the stairs first, followed by her general counsel, Whitaker Sloan, and 2 members of her flight crew, and she crossed the tarmac toward his fence line with an urgency that had never once appeared in the boardroom. She told him she needed him back before sunrise. And for the first time since he had known her, she did not sound like she expected to be obeyed. 3 days before that jet ever touched down outside his house, Kingsley Aeronautics had gathered its senior engineers for the final certification review of the Sovereign X, the company's newest twin-engine business jet, built to carry a contract worth $1.3 billion, if it could prove itself in a single demonstration flight before Graham Rathel, chief executive of Rathel Global Aviation. Nolan had been the architect of the aircraft's flight control integration, the man responsible for signing the document that declared the jet fit to fly, a role he had earned only after years spent building a smaller company with his late wife, dedicated entirely to recovery systems for aircraft electronics. After her passing, he had sold most of that company away, keeping only the core patents through a family trust, and Kingsley Aeronautics had hired him specifically to weave that recovery architecture into the bones of the Sovereign X. His strength had never been in any single component, but in understanding how every system on the aircraft spoke to every other system, a perspective few of his colleagues shared, and fewer still respected, until they needed it desperately. In that final review, he discovered a late software update that tied the cabin entertainment system directly into the aircraft's central data network. The update had never completed interference testing, and there was no way to know for certain whether it would corrupt the timing signals the flight computers depended on. He refused to sign the readiness certificate, not because he was certain of disaster, but because no one, including him, had proof that disaster would not happen. Camden Vale, the company's chief operating officer, accused him openly of stalling the program out of stubbornness. And when Genevieve asked whether the risk was guaranteed to cause an accident, Nolan told her plainly that no one could know that yet, because the necessary tests had never been run. To Genevieve, that uncertainty sounded like an engineer protecting his own caution, rather than protecting the aircraft. In front of the room, she reminded him that he had walked out of meetings before to care for his daughter, and she suggested, in words sharp enough to draw silence from everyone present, that he no longer had the dedication a role like his required. Nolan answered her without raising his voice, saying that nothing about his daughter changed what the data showed, and that the data showed a system nobody had finished testing. Camden produced a pre-written certification form and slid it across the table, and Nolan refused it a second time. Genevieve tore the document in half, and told the room that a man who did not believe in his own company's product had no business representing it, and she fired him on the spot. His badge was deactivated before he had even reached the elevator, a detail that would matter enormously in the days that followed. Rhett Calder, the company's chief test pilot, objected to replacing the certifying engineer on the eve of a major flight, but he was told to stand down. Maris Holloway, a younger engineer who had trained under Nolan for years, wanted to walk out with him in protest, but he asked her to stay behind and protect what data she could. Genevieve, unmoved, told the assembled staff that a company with more than 1,000 engineers could not be held hostage by one father, who had, in her words, lost his ambition somewhere along the way. Before Nolan left the building for good, he uploaded one final warning into an unalterable company archive, stating in plain language that the untested update could trigger the aircraft's integrity lock and freeze the jet on the ground. Camden authorized the installation of that same update the night before the demonstration flight, believing his own engineers could manage any consequences that arose. His real purpose was quieter than a simple software refresh, since the update also changed how the aircraft calculated and reported its fuel consumption, a number the marketing department had already promised the world. When the system powered on for its final pre-flight check, the 3 flight computers began reporting conflicting data, and the aircraft's protective architecture, a layer Nolan had designed years earlier, called Sentinel Bridge, recognized the mismatch instantly. Sentinel Bridge existed for exactly this purpose, verifying that every computer aboard the aircraft was running approved, unaltered software before allowing the flight systems to leave their dormant state. And the moment it detected an unauthorized change, it triggered what the engineering team called an integrity lock. The cabin still had power, lights still worked, but the engines refused to start. The flight controls refused to activate, and every test result the crew tried to pull was quarantined behind a wall of code no one in the hangar had written. The hangar filled with the particular tension of a deadline that could not be moved. Phones ringing constantly between the test floor and executive offices, coffee going cold on every workbench, as engineers tried one theory after another. 28 engineers worked through the night trying to break the lock, swapping out computers, sensors, and data converters, and every substitution only tightened the system's resistance, because each new part carried its own unique signature that clashed further with the others. A few of the younger staff whispered that the aircraft itself seemed almost stubborn, as though it understood something the humans around it refused to admit. And in a strange way, they were not entirely wrong. Maris found Nolan's archived warning within hours and brought it straight to Genevieve, pointing out that the exact scenario he had predicted was now unfolding on the hangar floor. Camden suggested simply deleting Sentinel Bridge from the aircraft entirely, and Maris had to explain, patiently and under pressure, that stripping out the protective layer would void the jet's entire certification. Rhett refused outright to fly the aircraft, even if the engines could somehow be forced awake, since a forced start meant flying blind on the very safeguard designed to catch dangerous inconsistencies. Under the terms of the contract, the demonstration flight had to begin before 8 in the morning, and if it did not, Rathel held the right to cancel the order and demand every dollar of the deposit returned. Genevieve called Nolan first, then again, then a dozen more times. And when he did not answer, she ordered a car sent to intercept him, only to learn that his home sat more than 200 miles from the test facility. She ordered a spare jet prepared instead, brushing aside Whitaker's warning that chasing down a man she had just humiliated would cost her a dignity she might never fully recover. Her answer was immediate and unsentimental: that losing face mattered far less than losing $1.3 billion. The backup jet lifted off at 24 minutes past 11 that night, carrying a chief executive who had spent 3 days insisting she needed no one, now racing across the dark toward the one engineer she had publicly discarded. Above the clouds, the countdown to the demonstration flight had already fallen below 8 hours, and every minute in the air was a minute the ground crew could not afford to lose. Standing outside Nolan's fence, Genevieve tried at first to hold on to her old authority, telling him to pack his things and board the jet immediately, as though nothing between them had changed. Nolan asked evenly, under what title exactly was she summoning him? She offered 10 times his former salary without hesitation, and he reminded her that 3 days ago she had stood in front of the entire engineering staff and declared he could be replaced within the hour. Whitaker stepped in to soften the moment, explaining that the Sovereign X had locked itself into a state no one on the technical team could unravel. Nolan asked directly whether they had installed the update he had refused to approve, and Genevieve's silence answered the question more clearly than any words could have. He told her he would not board the aircraft until he understood the full truth of what had happened, and she countered with escalating offers: a $1 million bonus if the jet flew on schedule, a new title, and full restoration of everything he had lost in salary. Nolan turned all of it down. Instead, he laid out 5 conditions of his own: that every bit of system data be preserved exactly as it stood, that no one delete or overwrite a single log entry, that the flight crew refused to fly until certification was genuinely complete, that an independent inspector be present for every step of the process, and that final technical authority over the aircraft be returned to him in writing before he did anything else. Genevieve accused him of exploiting a crisis for personal gain, and Nolan answered that the person exploiting the crisis was the one willing to send an unsafe aircraft into the sky to protect a bonus. Genevieve paced along the fence line as she listened, clearly unaccustomed to a negotiation she did not control from the very first sentence, and more than once she glanced back toward the idling jet, as though hoping its presence alone might hurry Nolan along. He did not hurry. He let each condition land fully before moving to the next, watching her expression shift from irritation to something closer to grudging recognition that she had run out of easy leverage. Whitaker confirmed quietly that every condition Nolan had listed was fully within his legal rights, and he added a detail that landed heavier than anything else said that night: that the company had never actually completed the paperwork to replace Nolan as the certifying engineer of record. Genevieve had no remaining leverage, and she signed the authorization on the hood of his pickup truck, under the glow of a single porch light. Nolan did not change into a suit or pack a bag. He simply grabbed his toolcase, a folder of his own patent records, and walked up the stairs of the jet that had come to fetch him. Before the cabin door sealed shut, he turned to Genevieve one last time and told her he was not coming back to rescue her deal, but to make certain no one flew that morning on a lie dressed up as Data. Now, before we get to what Nolan uncovers inside that hangar, if this story has you hooked, hit that like button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It genuinely helps this channel, Fireside Files, keep bringing you stories like this one. The jet carrying Nolan touched down at the test facility just before 3 in the morning, and word of his return spread through the hangar faster than anyone could have anticipated. Several executives assumed he had orchestrated the entire crisis to cast himself as a hero returning in triumph. Camden made no effort to hide his contempt, referring to Nolan within earshot as a temporary consultant brought in to clean up his own mess. Nolan did not argue the point. He simply asked everyone to stop swapping hardware and stand back so he could actually see what the system was telling them. He began by pulling the timestamps on every recent software update, checking version numbers, verifying cryptographic signatures, and comparing the readings coming from all 3 flight computers side by side. It was slow, unglamorous work, the kind that offered no shortcuts and rewarded only patience, and more than one engineer in the hangar shifted uncomfortably as the hours passed without a visible result. Nolan ignored their impatience the way he had always ignored pressure that had nothing to do with the actual problem in front of him, tracing each inconsistency back through the system's history, one careful step at a time. Within the hour, he understood that the lockout was not the product of a broken component at all. 2 of the 3 computers were reporting real, unaltered performance data exactly as designed. The third was running a hidden calibration table that had never gone through a single round of formal approval. When he asked who had authorized it, Camden claimed it was only meant to optimize the flight profile for demonstration purposes, and Nolan asked again, more pointedly, who had actually signed off on it. No one in the hangar offered an answer. Using the recovery module he had built into the aircraft years earlier, Nolan shifted the system into a read-only diagnostic state, which lowered the integrity lock just enough to permit ground testing, though the engine still refused to start. Some of the younger engineers whispered that he had failed, and Nolan explained calmly that the goal was never to force the aircraft into motion, but to understand precisely why it refused to move in the first place. Maris handed him a copy of the warning she had preserved from 3 days earlier, and buried in the update's internal file structure. He found an entry logged under an internal project name that had never once appeared on any approved testing schedule. Genevieve, watching over his shoulder, insisted he simply fix the malfunction and leave the question of its origin for another day. Nolan told her plainly that he could not certify something he did not yet understand. When he finally opened the hidden log tied to that internal project, the very first approval entry traced directly back to Genevieve Kingsley's own executive account, time-stamped weeks before the demonstration flight had ever been scheduled. The project, quietly named Monarch inside the company's private systems, had rewritten the way the aircraft calculated and displayed its fuel consumption, stripping out the energy drawn by the cabin's climate control, its communication suite, and its auxiliary power unit, before the final number ever reached a report. That single adjustment made the Sovereign X appear nearly 8% more efficient than it was, a figure that happened to sit exactly where Kingsley needed it to sit, in order to satisfy the terms of the Rathel contract. Nolan confirmed that the altered figures alone would not have caused a mechanical failure in flight. What they had done instead was force 3 separate systems to operate on 3 separate versions of the truth, and Sentinel Bridge, doing precisely what it had been designed to do, refused to let a machine fly on a foundation that inconsistent. The scheme had never been designed as an act of open fraud, so much as a slow accumulation of small, convenient adjustments, each one justified in the moment as a reasonable interpretation of ambiguous testing standards. Camden had championed the approach for months, arguing internally that competitors were surely doing something similar, and that Kingsley could not afford to fall behind on paper, even if the underlying engineering had not quite caught up. What he had not accounted for was Sentinel Bridge, a system built by a man who had spent years imagining exactly this kind of quiet, incremental dishonesty, and designing an architecture that could not be talked out of noticing it. Camden insisted this was merely a difference in how results were presented, nothing more. Nolan told him that quietly changing a measurement method without disclosing it to the customer was not presentation. It was falsifying the outcome of a certified test. Genevieve admitted she had known about an optimization effort in general terms, while denying any grasp of its technical specifics, until Maris produced an email in which Nolan had explained the exact danger months earlier, an email to which Genevieve herself had replied that the engineering team needed to find a way to make the numbers work for the market. Whitaker warned that this single message could prove, beyond any doubt, that the chief executive had known about the problem well before it exploded into a crisis. Camden tried to order the deletion of the Monarch files from every company server, unaware that Nolan had already placed the entire system into a preservation state, under the authority Genevieve herself had signed over to him hours earlier, meaning every attempt to erase evidence was logged in real time. With the corrupted calibration table isolated and removed, Nolan restored a clean, verified version of the flight software. And for the first time that night, the three computers began reporting the same numbers to one another. The integrity lock lifted from the ground systems, and the engines were finally cleared to start on command. Genevieve immediately ordered the crew to prepare for the 8 o'clock demonstration, as though the crisis had simply ended. Nolan refused to sign the readiness certificate, explaining that the advertised fuel figures were still false, and that the aircraft had not yet completed the post-recovery testing required after an event of this magnitude. Genevieve's composure finally cracked, and she told him he had been brought back to repair a machine, not to put her on trial. He answered that the machine had already done something the board itself had never found the courage to do, which was refused to move forward on data it knew to be false. She turned to another senior engineer and demanded a signature on the certification form, but every engineer standing in that hangar, having just watched the evidence unfold in front of them, declined to put their name on it. Word of the failed demonstration reached Graham Rathel before sunrise, and he demanded a full and immediate explanation from Kingsley Aeronautics. Genevieve's public statement blamed a software conflict left behind by a former engineer, quietly recasting Nolan as the source of the very crisis he had just resolved. Reporters who had never set foot in the hangar began describing him as a disgruntled engineer holding the company hostage over his own termination, and Camden told at least 2 outlets that Nolan was refusing to release the aircraft until he received a massive personal payout. Nolan said nothing in response to any of it, choosing instead to spend the following hours compiling every log, timestamp, and signed record into a single package. He sent that package to 3 destinations at once: the board of directors, an independent aviation safety inspector, and legal counsel representing Rathel Global Aviation. The story spread quickly through industry circles, picked up by aviation trade publications, and eventually by general news outlets hungry for a simple narrative of corporate dysfunction. Few of them had access to the technical record, and fewer still seemed interested in waiting for it, content instead to run with whatever quote came fastest from Kingsley's communications team. Nolan watched none of it unfold in real time, choosing instead to stay in the hangar with Maris and Rhett, methodically building the record he knew would eventually matter far more than any headline. At home, briefly, Clara saw a clip of her father being criticized on the evening news and asked him quietly whether it was true. Nolan told her honestly that the company could still come after him legally, that he might even lose the house they lived in if this went badly enough, but that none of it changed what he had to do, because he could not let an aircraft fly on falsified numbers simply to protect his own reputation. Genevieve made one final attempt at a private resolution, offering $5 million, his old title back, and a promise of no litigation, on the sole condition that he sign a statement blaming the entire failure on outdated procedures he himself had once implemented. Nolan refused. That same evening, Whitaker quietly informed Nolan of a detail few people inside the company fully understood, that Sentinel Bridge had never actually been sold to Kingsley Aeronautics outright, only licensed under strict conditions requiring an independent safety review process, and a guarantee against retaliation toward the engineer who held final certification authority. Firing Nolan and then pressuring him to falsify a certificate had almost certainly violated that license outright. If the license were formally suspended, every one of the company's 19 aircraft still in active testing would be grounded immediately, a consequence far larger than a single failed demonstration flight. Genevieve understood the stakes as well as anyone in the building, but she believed Nolan would never risk triggering something so severe, certain that the weight of thousands of jobs would keep him silent. She was wrong. Within the hour, Nolan filed formal notice of the license violation, a single document that placed the entire Sovereign X program, not just the one aircraft outside his old front door, into immediate suspension. Margaret Winfield, chair of the board and heir to a long line of financial leadership within the company's largest shareholder family, called an emergency session at the test facility before the sun had fully risen. Genevieve took her usual seat as chief executive, though it was clear to everyone in the room that she no longer controlled the program tied to her own name. Graham Rathel attended in person, accompanied by his own legal counsel, no longer willing to accept assurances over the phone. Nolan was asked to walk the room through everything that had happened, and he chose not to begin with his own dismissal or the insults that had followed it. Instead, he laid out 6 plain facts in order: the original warning he had filed, his refusal to sign the readiness certificate, the unapproved update installed against his objection, the falsified fuel figures behind it, the integrity lock behaving exactly as it had been engineered to behave, and finally, the attempted deletion of evidence once the falsification came to light. Maris confirmed that Camden had personally directed the engineering team to bypass standard review procedures under deadline pressure. Rhett confirmed that Genevieve had pushed him more than once to fly aircraft before certification was genuinely complete. Whitaker laid out the exact terms of the intellectual property license, and what its violation meant for every aircraft still under Kingsley's roof. The room fell into an uncomfortable stillness as the timeline came together piece by piece, and even board members who had known Genevieve for years found themselves unable to meet her eyes across the table. Margaret took careful notes throughout, occasionally asking a clarifying question that cut straight to the heart of the matter without ever raising her voice, a habit that made her far more intimidating than any display of temper could have managed. Genevieve accused Nolan of weaponizing his patents for personal revenge, and he pointed out, without raising his voice, that he had never triggered any lockout, remotely or manually at all. The company's own unauthorized update had caused the aircraft to protect itself, exactly as it had been built to do from the very beginning. Graham Rathel stated plainly that falsified performance data alone was grounds to cancel the entire order, regardless of anything else discussed that morning. Margaret asked Genevieve directly why she had dismissed the one person with legal authority to certify the aircraft, only 3 days before its most important flight. And Genevieve answered that Nolan had shown insufficient loyalty to the company. Nolan replied that loyalty to a company could never outweigh the safety of the people who would eventually sit inside that aircraft. As the board dug further, they discovered that Genevieve's own executive bonus had been structured to increase sharply if the Rathel contract closed before the end of the fiscal quarter, a detail she had never disclosed to the full board. Camden, sensing the room turning fully against him, began shifting blame back onto Genevieve, insisting he had only followed her explicit direction. Genevieve, out of options, turned to Nolan directly and asked him to withdraw the license violation notice before the board took any further action. Nolan told her he intended to lay out his decision in front of the entire board, the client, and the same engineers who had once watched him walk out of the building in humiliation, and he would not soften a single part of it for her sake. Most of the people in that room expected Nolan to demand an enormous personal settlement, or to sell his patents to a rival manufacturer out of spite, or simply to shut the entire Sovereign X program down out of principle. Instead, he told them plainly that he had no interest in destroying the company. Thousands of engineers and machinists on the factory floor had never given a single order to falsify data, and punishing all of them for the choices of a handful of executives struck him as its own kind of injustice. He agreed to restore the safety license under 7 conditions of his own design. Genevieve and Camden would be removed entirely from authority over the Sovereign X program. Every fuel consumption figure released to the public would be corrected and republished using verified data. Rathel Global Aviation would receive full access for its own independent inspection team. No employee who had come forward with evidence would face retaliation of any kind. The company's independent safety board, quietly dissolved years earlier, would be fully reinstated. Every future test flight would require sign-off from the engineer holding technical responsibility, free from interference by anyone in an executive role. And a portion of executive bonus compensation would be redirected permanently into a dedicated safety and training fund. Several board members pressed him to reconsider, certain that a man in his position could easily negotiate for far more than a set of structural safeguards. But Nolan remained unmoved by the suggestion that he was leaving value on the table. He explained that he had spent enough of his career watching short-term incentives quietly erode long-term safety, and that no amount of money could undo the damage of a single catastrophic failure, once it actually happened in the air rather than on a hangar floor. Margaret found herself, almost against her own expectations, agreeing with nearly every word he said, and she made a private note to ensure his conditions were written into the company's governance documents, rather than treated as a temporary concession. Nolan did not ask to become chief executive himself, and he made clear that his only real demand was that technical authority could never again be overridden by someone chasing a deadline or a bonus. Graham Rathel agreed to keep the contract alive, on the condition that the corrected data passed a fully independent verification process. Margaret called for an immediate board vote. Genevieve was suspended from her position as chief executive before the meeting adjourned. Camden was terminated outright. His conduct referred for a formal internal investigation. The company offered Nolan an enormous lump sum to purchase his patents outright and remove himself from the picture entirely, and he turned that offer down as well, choosing instead to issue a new, narrower license that legally bound the company to maintain its safety standards going forward, rather than simply cashing out and walking away. What struck almost everyone in that room was how easily Nolan could have destroyed the company, or made himself extraordinarily wealthy in a single stroke, and how deliberately he chose neither path, protecting the workforce and the future passengers instead. He told Genevieve quietly before the meeting ended that she had flown to his front door that night to save a deal, while he had returned to save a company from the very people running it into the ground. For the first time in the company's history, the chief executive's chair at Kingsley Aeronautics sat empty, as Nolan walked back across the hangar floor in the same worn work boots Genevieve had once mocked him for wearing to an executive briefing. Over the following 3 weeks, the Sovereign X underwent a complete round of retesting under full independent oversight, and the corrected data told a very different story than the one Kingsley had originally promised the market. The aircraft did not achieve the 14% fuel efficiency gain once splashed across every marketing document. The true, verified improvement measured closer to 7.5%, still a meaningful advance over the previous generation, just not the inflated figure Genevieve had once been willing to protect at any cost. Graham Rathel did not walk away from the contract entirely. He reduced the size of the initial order, but signed a new agreement built entirely on transparent, independently verified numbers, allowing the program to survive without a single further lie propping it up. Maris was promoted to lead the company's entire avionics integration division, a role she had earned through months of quiet, careful work that finally received the recognition it deserved. Rhett retained full authority to refuse any flight on safety grounds, a right the company could no longer strip away on a whim. Whitaker, for his part, used the crisis as the foundation for a complete overhaul of how the company structured its intellectual property agreements going forward, ensuring no future executive could quietly pressure an engineer of record the way Genevieve once had. Graham Rathel later remarked to colleagues that the entire episode had actually deepened his confidence in Kingsley Aeronautics rather than destroyed it, since a company willing to expose its own failure so completely was, in his estimation, far safer to fly with than one that had never been tested at all. Nolan accepted a newly created position as Independent Director of System Safety, reporting directly to the board rather than to any chief executive, a structure specifically designed to prevent what had nearly happened from ever happening again. He continued to live at Red Creek because he had no intention of uprooting Clara's life for a corner office, choosing instead to travel to headquarters only when a major review truly required his presence. Genevieve lost her title, her bonus, and control over the very program she had once treated as the crowning achievement of her career. There was no public humiliation staged in her name, no vindictive campaign waged against her once the dust settled. The heaviest consequence she faced was simply watching the Sovereign X succeed, once it had been freed from every decision she had personally made along the way. When the aircraft finally completed its new demonstration flight, every figure behind it verified by outside eyes rather than internal convenience, Nolan did not step onto a stage to accept applause. He simply walked back to the terminal and checked the system logs one more time, the way he always did, because a completed flight was never the end of the responsibility, only a single successful moment inside a much longer one. Months later, Nolan sat once again at his workbench in the small house beside the runway at Red Creek, soldering another old radio back to life, while the evening settled quietly over the field. Clara asked whether he ever regretted turning down enough money to stop working entirely for the rest of his life. He told her that money could buy comfort, but it could never undo a signature placed carelessly on a document that put someone else in danger. A Sovereign X on a routine test flight passed overhead as they spoke, its silhouette catching the last orange light of the day. This time it did not descend in desperation, to beg him for a solution to a crisis born of someone else's dishonesty. It simply made a normal approach, continued along its scheduled test route, and disappeared toward the horizon exactly as planned. His phone rang once, and this time it was Maris on the line, telling him that the system had just flagged a minor discrepancy in the latest test data, and that the engineering team had already chosen, on their own initiative, to pause and investigate before going any further. No one on that call had tried to hide the discrepancy or bury it in a private file only executives could see. No one had threatened an engineer for simply asking a difficult question. Nolan allowed himself a small, quiet smile, understanding that the most important change to come out of everything he had lived through was never a line of code at all. It was the fact that the people now running the aircraft had finally learned to listen to the systems, and to the engineers responsible for them, before ambition ever had the chance to override caution again. Clara sat beside him on the porch step, watching the last light fade off the wing of the departing aircraft, and asked whether he thought Genevieve had learned anything at all from everything that happened. Nolan considered the question honestly before answering, telling her that some people only learned lessons when the consequences finally became too large to explain away, and that whether Genevieve counted among them was not something he needed to know in order to sleep well at night. What mattered to him was simpler than any boardroom outcome: the fact that the next aircraft to leave that runway would carry passengers who trusted a system built to tell the truth, even when powerful people preferred it silent. He looked out toward the stretch of runway where Genevieve's jet had once landed in the middle of the night, certain that money and authority alone could force him back into a life he had already chosen to leave behind. She had arrived believing that power could simply purchase whatever it needed. What actually brought Nolan back was never a plea, a title, or a number with more zeros attached to it than he could easily count. It was a plain, unglamorous sense of duty toward the strangers who would one day trust their lives to a machine he had helped build, and to the truth that machine deserved to fly on. The chief executive had flown across the country in the dead of night to force a single father back onto her payroll and save her jet. Yet in the end, it was that same overlooked engineer who saved the entire company, using nothing more than the one signature he had refused, from the very beginning, to give away for free. Thanks for watching this Fireside Files story to the very end. If you enjoyed it, hit subscribe and let us know in the comments which character you trust more, Nolan or Genevieve. We'll see you in the next one.